live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek. In this video, we're going to talk about the Star Trek episode Where No Man Has Gone Before. This is a weird one. This is the third episode of the original series, and what's weird about it is we've had the Mantrap and Charlie X, where they use the regular uniforms and communicators and phasers that we'll know throughout the entirety of the series. But in Where No Man Has Gone Before, they go back to the crappy, cheap-looking uniforms and communicators that were actually used in the pilot episode, The Cage. It's not real clear why they've done that. I assume that this was actually the first one that was filmed, even though it was the third episode that aired. Also, Spock's eyebrows are wrong, because Spock, his eyebrows are kind of point out this way, but in this episode they're like boom, basically like 90-degree angle up. So they look very odd. Spock is also very awkward in this episode. Like, at one point, Spock and Kirk are playing chess, and Kirk says, "Has anyone ever told you play a very irritating game of chess, Mr. Spock?" And Spock is like, "Irritating? Oh yes, one of your Earth emotions." Like, okay, I get that you're establishing that this is a character who is logical and unemotional, etc., but wow, bad writing. Do better, Star Trek. I know you. I don't know what that was. That was stupid. I shouldn't have done that. Anyway, back to Where No Man Has Gone Before. So, in this episode, we have a chap named Gary Mitchell. He is the helmsman, and when the Enterprise goes to the edge of the galaxy, no particular reason given, but they just want to head out of the galaxy, take a quick look around, and come back in and see what's going on. When they go out of the galaxy, Gary Mitchell he's like basically electrocuted. Gary Mitchell and Elizabeth Denner, who's a psychologist, they both get sort of zapped along with, I think it's 9 other crew members. The other 9 of them die. Gary Mitchell gets these kind of crazy gray, starry kind of eyes. Elizabeth's just sort of like, whatevs, I got zapped, but I'm fine. And then Gary Mitchell increasingly starts to develop, he develops telekinesis. He develops the ability to read incredibly rapidly. Like, he will click the button to turn the page, click, 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 and he's reading each of these pages and memorizing the content. He says he's gone through about half of the ship's library in a day. He develops the ability to read minds. He develops the ability to sort of shoot lightning bolts out of his hand, etc., etc. Over the course of the year. This isn't immediate, but his ESP, his telekinesis, all of this stuff grows over the course of the episode. And so he increasingly becomes a threat to the crew. Kirk and Spock, with the largely emotionally more than scientifically driven dissent of Elizabeth Denner, they decide that they have to maroon Gary on a mining planet that's fully automated. Because they recognize that he has become a threat. His abilities make him a threat to the Enterprise and to the other crew members. Gary Mitchell, because he now has the ability to read minds, knows that they have developed this plan, and he's not super keen on it. He decides instead that he wants to choose what planet he's going to be marooned on so that he can remake that planet to be a paradise with himself as the god. Kirk, Spock, and the others are not super keen on that plan, so they basically manage to drug Gary, take him down to the planet. They plan to maroon him, but then he uses his telekinesis to murder one of the other crew members. Then he and Elizabeth, who's started now to develop her own telekinetic and extrasensory perception abilities, they run off into the wilderness of this planet, and Kirk takes a phase rifle and basically goes after them to kill Gary Mitchell. Not real clear why he thinks that's super, super important, instead of just letting Gary and Elizabeth have that planet and do whatever they want. But he goes off. Gary Mitchell is basically like, I'm the god of this planet. Ha ha ha. Fruit trees. Spring of water. Oh, it's great. And Elizabeth's like, this is super cool. I'm really happy here. Then Gary Mitchell's like, Kirk is coming. Elizabeth, go talk to Kirk. See how insignificant humans are. And Kirk tries to convince her to help him stop Gary Mitchell. She's initially like, nope, I'm not going to do that. And then Gary Mitchell shows up and he's all like, now you will bow to me, Kirk. And he forces Kirk to bow. Digs him a nice grave. Interestingly enough, the name on the gravestone is James R. Kirk rather than James T. Kirk. Because as everyone knows, Captain Kirk's middle name is Tiberius, not something starting with R. So, not an infallible god, apparently, since he doesn't know Kirk's middle name, even though they've apparently been friends for like 15 years. Anyway, that's a minor point. Gary Mitchell plans to kill Kirk. At which point Elizabeth is kind of like, this doesn't seem fantastic, so electrics! And she kind of blasts Gary Mitchell with some lightning bolts. Gary Mitchell blasts her with some lightning bolts. They have a god fight back and forth. Elizabeth is sort of fatally injured. Gary Mitchell is drained enough that he can have a fist fight with Captain Kirk, who, of course, his shirt gets ripped open because it's Kirk and that's what happens to him during fights. This is the first time we get that in the show, by the way. Interestingly enough, in the previous episode, Charlie X, Kirk appeared without a shirt on during the weird attempt to teach Charlie judo, no chest hair. In this episode, Kirk's shirt gets ripped open, chest hair. Makes you wonder. Anyway, unimportant. So, finally, Kirk manages to basically blast some rocks and bury Gary Mitchell under an avalanche of rocks in the grave that was intended for Kirk. Elizabeth dies, the crew pieces out. So, what's the social justice element to this episode? Well, I think the thing is eugenics. And the question of eugenics, because eugenics is essentially an attempt to improve the human race, improve the human species. And there's a number of approaches that people have taken to this, including some early stage moves toward genetic engineering, but often this involves things like racial supremacy programs, often identifying a particular race, ethnicity, or nationality as the superior group. This often involves, for instance, forced sterilization of people with physical or intellectual disabilities, people of racial or ethnic minorities, people of undesirable religious groups, etc., etc. It often involves genocide. I mean, the Nazi program of eliminating Jews, eliminating the Roma, eliminating LGBT people, eliminating people with physical and mental disabilities, etc., etc. This was all grounded in eugenics. And the Nazis didn't invent eugenics by any stretch of the imagination. Eugenics was an extraordinarily popular idea particularly starting in sort of the mid-1800s into the early 1900s. And a lot of bad stuff occurred out of eugenics ideas. And Star Trek returns to eugenics later on a number of times. But Gary Mitchell is that sort of more advanced human. And so in this case, we don't have genetic engineering, we don't have ethnic cleansing, we don't have forced sterilizations, etc., etc. We have a sort of freak accident where, for whatever reason, there's a barrier at the edge of the galaxy, and when Gary Mitchell and Elizabeth and these other crew members who have high ESP ratings come into contact with that, it alters their brains in some way. Most of them, it alters their brains by turning the lights out. But for Gary and Elizabeth, it alters their brains by developing their mental abilities, their mental faculties beyond the norm. The problem with this again, this is not rooted in a lot of the very nasty stuff that's been associated with eugenics in actual human history. The problem is what happens when you have that superior human. What does their attitude toward regular humans, toward Homo sapiens, become? How do they view us? And the speculation of the show is someone who is far enough advanced over the abilities of normal human beings. As Kirk puts it, I'm paraphrasing here because I can't remember the exact line, it would not only become insignificant, but actually an annoyance. Actually, it might be Spock that says that. But Gary Mitchell's attitude toward human beings becomes not only uninterested in the affairs, problems, concerns of humanity, but actively hostile. Right before they're going to transport him down to the planet, while he's fighting the sedatives that they've given him, he does say, I could squash you all like insects. And then when he sends Elizabeth to go talk to Kirk right before the final climactic battle, he does tell her, go see how insignificant they are. So this is kind of the idea. This is kind of the concern that the episode Where No Man Has Gone Before raises, is that if you have someone whose abilities vastly outstrip the norm, the human norm, then realistically, in a way, that person starts to look at other human beings the way that human beings all too often look at animals, particularly insects, mice, rats, creatures that we consider pests. That not only is it ethically permissible to destroy them, in some cases it's actually seen as a duty to do so. And that, of course, raises its own set of larger issues in terms of how we ethically regard the lives of non-human creatures. But I think that's a little bit further than this episode really directly allows us to go.